evening and welcome back to the Myra Kraft Open Classroom. Just within the last day or so, we saw a major shift in the United States Supreme Court with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett as a new justice to that court. Now, here we did not plan to have a Supreme Court appointment take place in the week that we planned for tonight's discussion. But we're very fortunate to have with us this evening scholars who will comment on what's been going on within the court system, within our judicial system over the past few years. Tonight's discussion could hardly be more directly relevant to what's going on in the world and what's going on in America at this moment. My name is Ted Landsmark. I'm director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. I want to emphasize that tonight's discussion is being live streamed and will be archived for folks who may not be able to join us this evening. I also want to point out that we have reserved time for questions and answers at the end of the presentations this evening. We ask that you post those questions in our Q&A box. And we will get to as many of them as we possibly can. And I'll also note that next week, which is the Wednesday after the election, we will be holding what will amount to not quite a free-for-all, but a very open conversation about what we then know about the election and the effects and implications that that may have. One of our lead guests next week will be Governor Michael Dukakis. With that, I'm delighted to be able to turn the discussion over to my brilliant and irreverent law school colleague, Professor Dan Urman. Dan, you're on.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's my pleasure to introduce my friend and my former teacher, Michael Klarman, tonight. He's going to be talking about the degradation of democracy and the court, which will be in the Harvard Law Review Supreme Court issue this fall. Professor Klarman is the Kirkland and Ellis professor at Harvard Law School, which he joined in 2008. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania, his JD from Stanford Law School, and his DPhil in legal history from the University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. After law school, Professor Klarman clerked for the Honorable Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and Professor Klarman was an award-winning teacher and scholar at the University of Virginia, until Harvard Law School convinced him to come to Boston, and we've been better for it. So I'm going to pass this over to Mike. Mike's presentation will be somewhere between 40 and 50 minutes. Again, please ask any of your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. And then afterwards, Bob Kuttner, who is a professor at Brandeis and who founded the American Prospect, will also be commenting on Mike Klarman's presentation. So thank you all. And Mike, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ted. I'm going to try to get to the 40 minutes rather than the 50. So I'm going to cut some things and maybe speed up the presentation a little. There are three points I want to talk about. One is the Barrett appointment. The second is what I've called the degradation of American democracy. And the third is what to do about it, which will include the topic of court reform. So with regard to Barrett, her confirmation will give, will give the conservatives a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. Even without her appointment, according to studies done by political scientists and law professors, this is already the most conservative Supreme Court since the 1930s. Now, she's not meaningfully different from anybody else Trump did or would put on the Supreme Court, or indeed any other Republican president. I think it's worth emphasizing that President Trump is a threat to democracy in innumerable ways, which I'll mention, but his court appointments are no different from those of a President Romney or a President McCain. In terms of ideological balance, Chief Justice Roberts is no longer the swing vote. He has voted strategically with liberals on several occasions in an effort to protect the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. That's the ACA case in 2012, the census question case in 2019, the Louisiana abortion case last term, and the DACA case, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals case. Now Kavanaugh is probably the swing justice, and if you have a look at his opinion in the Wisconsin voting case from Monday, you'll see that the swing justice is now extremely conservative. Barrett purports to be a textualist and originalist, just like her mentor, Justice Scalia. She's given speeches suggesting she might defer less to precedent than Justice Scalia, but Scalia certainly would have overruled Roe, just as Barrett's probably will, or at least she'll gut the decision so that states are free to regulate abortion in much more substantial ways. She almost certainly would have invalidated the Affordable Care Act in 2012, just as Scalia voted to. That doesn't mean the court will do so in the case that's coming up in another week or so. Most experts think the current challenge will be rejected, and I would go out on a limb and say if Biden wins big next week, which is a pretty likely outcome, the court will have no interest in striking down the ACA. Barrett will almost certainly gut race-based affirmative action in the same way that Scalia would have. She will expand the Second Amendment to strike down gun control. She would vote to gut campaign finance regulation, though most of it's already been gutted by the current Republican justices. She would expand rights to religious exemptions under the First Amendment, probably overturning a Scalia opinion from 30 years ago, which is one illustration of how radical the right of the court has become. She would cut back on the power of administrative agencies to interpret law and expand the power of presidents to control those agencies. The last is a large part of why conservative billionaires like the Koch brothers have been willing to invest so much money, hundreds of millions of dollars each electoral cycle in the Republican Party, tens of millions of dollars which go to dark money campaigns to support these conservative Supreme Court appointments. The Koch brothers don't care about abortion. They don't care about gay marriage. They care about Chamber of Commerce issues and dismantling the modern administrative state, mostly from their perspective, because they don't want any environmental regulation, because their business is fossil fuel extraction. Now, I want to just say one more quick thing about Barrett, and then I'll move on to my focal point, which is the degradation of democracy. The conservative justices profess to be textualist and originalist, but this is actually a canard. The conservatives would say, and Barrett did say, that conservatives follow the law, whereas the liberals mostly make it up, but that's absurd. If you look at conservative hypocrisy on issues like race-based affirmative action, campaign finance reform, and their broad interpretations of the right to keep and bear arms, none of those grow naturally or even plausibly out of the text of the Constitution. None of them is based on the original understanding. This is conservative activism striking down laws adopted by Democratic legislatures based on the justices' own policy preferences, which is exactly what they condemn liberal justices for doing. All justices are and always have been influenced by things like their own personal values, their perception of how much political pressure the court can bear, and things like changing social mores. The conservative justices like to pretend otherwise. They profess to be umpires calling balls and strikes, whereas the liberals are a little bit more candid about what's really going on. But the important point to understand is all judges engaging in the act of constitutional interpretation everywhere and always have infiltrated their own values into the Constitution. It's probably inevitable, and don't believe it when somebody tells you one side does that, but the other side is somehow doing law. All right, second, the degradation of American democracy. I want to talk about two different things here. The first, I think, is probably pretty apparent to anyone who reads the newspaper, which is that the President of the United States has a pretty open authoritarian bent. He doesn't actually try to hide it. Some people would defend him, saying his bark is worse than his bite, but he actually means and tries to implement most of what he says. The president criticizes freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He attacks independent judges. He politicizes the Justice Department, as well as the intelligence agencies, the Postal Service, the Department of Homeland Security, the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration. Essentially, any agency of government that might be politically useful to him, he sees as his own tool to use as he pleases. He's also made unprecedented use of the federal government for personal benefit, deriving millions of dollars that go into his pocket from taxpayers. He's an open and notorious racist. He directly encourages violence. He's eviscerated fundamental norms of transparency in government. He manifests a bizarre admiration for foreign autocrats, and he delegitimizes elections and the political opposition, whom he calls traitors and threatens to lock up. Now, all of that is copiously documented. If you read the newspapers, I can't even believe any of it's controversial. The president's quite open about this. Now, I want you to just step back for a minute and think about how extraordinary this is, because it's easy to get swept up in the craziness of the moment. Literally every day in the newspaper, there's something else to look at that people would have regarded as extraordinary just a few years ago. The president of the United States every day is demanding that his attorney general prosecute and incarcerate his political adversaries, including the previous president of the United States, Barack Obama. He's refusing repeatedly to commit to a peaceful transition of power. He's refusing to firmly condemn white supremacy, and he's actively and persistently undermining the legitimacy of the coming election because he's pretty confident he's going to lose it. All of this is straight out of the autocratic playbook used by somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. And it's worth emphasizing the Republican Party submits to all of this with barely a whimper of protest. Now, the other part of the degradation of democracy, which I think is actually less well known to most people, is what the Republican Party has been doing for about the last 15 years to undermine democracy at the state level. Here I'm talking about various methods of voter suppression, purges of the voter rolls, grotesque forms of gerrymandering that preserve Republican legislative majorities in the face of minoritarian vote, delaying and even trying to cancel elections, eviscerating the powers of Democratic governors when they win gubernatorial elections, and rejecting the results of voter initiatives when Republican legislatures don't like the policies that are embraced by majorities of voters, such as expanding Medicaid or demanding nonpartisan commissions to draw election district boundaries. Why are these things happening now? The Republican Party didn't do any of this stuff in the 1990s. Why now? There are basically two factors. First, the national electorate is more closely divided between the two major political parties than has generally been true over the last half century. The entirety of the 20th century. Control of the presidency in both chambers of commerce are usually at stake in every election, which was not generally true for large chunks of American history. The 537 votes in Florida that determined the outcome of the 2000 presidential election drove this point home. Suppressing a few thousand votes here and there can make the difference in elections that have extraordinary political consequences. The second factor is a combination of dramatic demographic change, secularization, and growing social liberalism that's led the Republican Party to conclude that their political agenda no longer commands majority support. Recognizing that Republican candidates perform better in elections as the voting populace diminishes, Republicans have chosen to shrink the electorate and engage in other electoral machinations like partisan gerrymandering, rather than to alter their agenda to make it more popular. So I'll give you two examples here. North Carolina is a good illustration because it demonstrates what actually has been going on across the country in essentially every state where Republicans have managed to secure control of the entire government. 7 weeks after the Supreme Court in 2013 struck down the pre-clearance provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Republicans enacted a multifaceted electoral law that, for example, imposed a strict voter ID requirement that excluded the forms of identification most often used by young people and persons of color. Now, the legislature had never previously thought any voter identification requirement was necessary, but African Americans turned out to vote at higher rates than whites for the first time in American history in 2008 and 2012 with Obama on the ballot, and Latino and college student turnout also increased. The new law also shortened the early voting period, restricted same-day voter registration, eliminated provisional ballots for those turning up at the wrong precinct on election day, and terminated pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. In framing the bill, Republican legislators, according to a subsequent judicial finding, quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, close quote. For example, African Americans were more than twice as likely as whites to opt for same-day registration and significantly more likely to use early voting and provisional ballots. During the litigation challenging the law, one federal judge asked the state's lawyers, why doesn't North Carolina want people to vote? Well, the answer is clear enough, because Republicans believe that the more people who vote, the less likely their party is to win elections. I'm going to give you another example of the Republicans' commitment to voter suppression, which is the youth vote. Majority of young people today do not think very well of Trump or the Republican Party. There was a poll this week that showed that among 18 to 24-year-olds, Trump will lose to Biden by about 35 percentage points. Among college students, that number is likely to grow to 50 percentage points. If only college students or only people under the age of 30 were voting in this election, the Republican Party would be annihilated in a landslide. Rather than changing their policies to try to appeal to a younger demographic, Republican legislatures are trying to make it harder for young people to vote. A couple examples. In 2014 in Florida, the Republican Secretary of State barred early voting sites from public university campuses, a decision later struck down by a federal court. In 2016, Florida college students voted by a margin of greater than 2-to-1 for Hillary Clinton in a state that was divided almost literally down the middle. 2 years later, in 2018, college students cast about 60,000 votes on campus, more than the margin of victory for Republicans in both the US Senate seat and the gubernatorial election in Florida that year. Unwilling to abandon their efforts to suppress the college student vote in 2019, the Republican legislature passed and the Republican governor signed a law requiring all early voting sites to offer, quote, sufficient non-permitted parking, close quote, which is a way of shutting them off of college campuses where such parking is notoriously difficult to find. After narrowly losing both the Senate race and the state's presidential contest in 2016, New Hampshire Republicans complained that 5,000 out-of-staters had illegally voted in the election. Those supposedly illegal voters turned out to be New Hampshire college students from out of state who were absolutely entitled to vote under state law. In response, Republicans enacted a law requiring out-of-state college students to establish residency rather than mere domicile to be eligible to vote. What that means concretely is an out-of-state college student now needs to obtain an in-state driver's license and an in-state car registration, which together cost hundreds of dollars. So this is essentially like a Jim Crow era poll tax. You're charging young people to vote because they're too likely to vote Democratic. One final example, though I could easily multiply these, the percentage of American college students who are casting ballots doubled between 2014 and 2018. That higher turnout benefits Democrats even in Texas, where the students voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Austin Community College, which has 72,000 students, most of whom are working class students from families of color, used its own money in 2018 to establish a mobile early voting site to service its campuses, as did many other colleges in Texas. In response, Republicans in the legislature enacted a law requiring that all polling places remain open during the entire 12-day early voting period, which eliminates pop-up mobile voting sites, which are only there for a day or two moving within campuses because those are the only ones these college campuses can afford. Now, again, I just want to step back and emphasize for a minute both how short-sighted politically this is and also how morally reprehensible this is. You're talking about working class young people from communities of color who are trying to advance their lives educationally and are trying to perform their civic responsibilities. And the Republican Party says to them, no, we don't really want you to vote because you're not going to vote for us. The Supreme Court will not rescue us from these sorts of anti-democratic measures of the Republican Party, or more precisely, the Republican justices won't protect us. The Supreme Court upholds strict voter ID laws and voter purges on the basis of the state interest in reducing voter fraud, which numerous studies show is basically a non-existent problem. The court refuses to do anything about political gerrymandering. The court struck down the pre-clearance provision of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the Supreme Court virtually single-handedly has undermined our political system by unleashing virtually unrestricted money in politics on the basis of contrived constitutional rationales. The court is a large part of the problem of the degradation of democracy. It's not likely to be a solution. All right, so the third part of my talk, how do you solve this problem of a rapidly degrading democracy? Well, the obvious thing is, and this may sound partisan, but it's not, if one party is undermining democracy, the other party needs to step up and protect it. Democrats need to take power at the national level and entrench democracy. Now, this is actually quite an uphill battle for Democrats because of various structural features of the American political system. Partisan gerrymandering and geographic clustering disadvantage Democrats in the House in every election, perhaps to the tune of as much as 30 seats. Massive malapportionment of the Senate may well doom Democrats' efforts to control the Senate anytime soon after the 2020 or 2022 election. By malapportionment, I simply mean that California, with almost 40 million people, and Wyoming, with barely 600,000, get the same 2 US senators. And then finally, there's the malapportionment and vagaries of the Electoral College, which actually give Donald Trump a 10% chance next Tuesday of being reelected while losing the popular vote, as he did in 2016. According to the best modeling, Trump's chances of being reelected president are roughly 10%, but almost all of that is losing the popular vote, but nonetheless winning in the Electoral College because of the Republicans' current systemic advantage in the Electoral College. Nonetheless, Democrats are still quite likely to have control of the national government in 2021. According to Nate Silver, the Democrats have a 3/4 chance of winning the Senate, almost a 90% chance of winning the presidency, and about a 98% chance of holding on to the Senate. My argument is Democrats had better use this power because there may not ever be again such a golden opportunity to protect democracy. The main features of protecting democracy would include making voter registration automatic when citizens turn 18, and for older citizens when they interact with government agencies such as a Department of Motor Vehicles. Same-day registration has been shown to enhance turnout without increasing fraud, as Republicans baselessly charge. Felon disfranchisement, which has enormous racially disparate impact and often was adopted with deliberate discriminatory intent in the 19th century, ought to be ended. Election day ought to be a national holiday. Gubernatorial elections ought to be shifted and take place on the same day as presidential elections, when voter turnout can be as much as 50% higher and is much more demographically representative of the country. The number of early voting days, polling places, and voting machines should be increased so that African Americans in working class neighborhoods in Atlanta don't have to wait 5 hours in line during the primaries and 10 hours a couple weeks ago on the first day of early voting, while wealthy white suburbanites like me literally don't have to wait more than 30 seconds to vote. That is a national scandal. Absentee ballots should be available without excuse. Onerous identification requirements should be eliminated because they reduce voting on the pretext of reducing fraud. Partisan gerrymandering should be ended. It serves no useful purpose. Public financing of elections would help reduce the influence of money on politics until the Supreme Court's egregious campaign finance decisions can be overturned. Having said all of this, it is quite plausible, perhaps even likely, the Supreme Court would invalidate such federal legislation, at least insofar as it sought to regulate state conduct of state elections. And again, to be more precise, the Republican justices on the Supreme Court would vote to invalidate such measures. So reform of the court may be unavoidable if democracy is to be successfully entrenched. Now, there are two different sorts of arguments for enlarging the court. The first of these is actually a response to the main argument against, and then the second is an independent affirmative case. So I'm going to start with the main argument against and respond to that, and then I'll make the affirmative case, and then I'll be done. So the main argument against expanding the size of the court is the obvious one you would intuit, which is if Democrats do this, Republicans will do this, will become ensconced in a cycle of endless retaliation, and the court will go on growing and growing, and this will be absurd. Now, there are three responses, which I want to get on the table, and then I'll just elaborate a minute on each of them. The three responses are: Republicans pack the court first, Democrats are only trying to unpack it. Second, Republicans would pack the court regardless of what Democrats do or don't do. And third, there is some possibility if you entrench democracy, that would actually create a new political era in which the Republican Party would stop assaulting democracy, would have to moderate its extreme right-wing views in order to win elections, might actually admit that it was wrong to pack the court, and Democrats, through their victories in politics, actually are entitled at this moment to control the court. So the first point is pretty straightforward. Republicans started this. What Mitch McConnell did in 2016 was unprecedented, literally. Nobody had ever stolen a Supreme Court in American history. Barack Obama was entitled to fill the Scalia seat. McConnell lied and said there was precedent for not filling seats in the last year of a presidential term. That was rated false by PolitiFact, but they were being courteous, and I'm not inclined toward courtesy. He lied. He stole the seat and he lied. You can argue that Ginsburg's death in September complicates the story, that Scalia died under Obama's presidency, Ginsburg died under Trump's presidency. They ought to cancel each other out. At the most, that would suggest Democrats should increase the size of the court by 2, but I actually think Democrats should increase it by 4. Democrats should control the court. Second point, and this is actually one I might just emphasize even more, Republicans are going to expand the court whenever they see it as being useful to their interests, and it doesn't matter what Democrats do. Pretty much McConnell admitted that this week when he said, we did what we were entitled to do in 2016. We had the power to do it. We didn't violate the Constitution. Yes, this week he said in 2020, we did what we were entitled to do. We didn't violate the Constitution. We have the power to do it. And as long as we don't violate the Constitution, that's what we should do. That's true. The Constitution doesn't bar any of these things, but they are playing a game of hardball, challenging traditional norms and traditions in a way that have never been challenged before. If Democrats expanded the size of the court in 2021, they'd be doing the same thing. They would clearly not be violating the Constitution. They would be challenging a norm in response to the Republicans' systematic norm breaking in the last 15 years. And if Democrats don't do it, Republicans will do it anyhow the first time they have the opportunity and the need. So consider this hypothetical. Joe Biden wins the election. Democrats control the Senate. That's more likely than not. There will be a 6-3 Republican majority. Suppose one beautiful spring day after we have vaccines, Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas decide they'll take a car ride over to National Stadium to see a baseball game. They are tragically killed in an auto accident. Joe Biden nominates 2 Democratic Court of Appeals judges who are confirmed by a Democratic Senate. Democrats now have a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court. Assume Joe Biden loses the presidency in 2024. Assume Democrats lose control of the Senate. Do you think for 1 second Mitch McConnell will not expand the court? He will say, I'm not doing anything wrong. I have the power to do this. Democrats talked about doing it in 2020. I'm just doing the same thing Democrats talked about doing. McConnell has played that sort of hardball systematically over the last 15 years. He blocked all of Obama's Court of Appeals nominees in the last 2 years of Obama's presidency. He abused the filibuster in a way that hasn't been abused throughout its history. There were more filibusters when he was minority leader than almost the entirety of the 20th century. He blocked Obama from appointing agency heads that rendered agencies dysfunctional because they did not have a quorum. He actually had the nerve to say to the president, "We will only confirm Republicans to the National Labor Relations Board. If you want the National Labor Relations Board to be functional, you have to agree to Republican appointees." He engineered it so essentially no Republicans supported the stimulus bill during the 2009 recession. That would be analogous to Democrats saying in the spring of 2020, we're not going to support pandemic relief because we don't want to help Donald Trump win re-election. Not a single Democrat said that, but every Republican in the House and all but 3 in the Senate said exactly that in response to Obama's relief bill in 2009. Unless I forget the most egregious instance, in 2011, the Republicans came within an inch of defaulting on the national debt in order to force Obama to make spending cuts. That was the height of irresponsibility. Nobody's ever done that in American history, but the Republican Party is willing to do that. At the state level in Arizona and Georgia, Republicans have already packed the state Supreme Courts. They attempted to do so in North Carolina. Governor Rick Scott said he would do so in Florida if a Democrat won the 2018 gubernatorial election, but the issue was mooted when narrowly Rick DeSantis prevailed. I want to emphasize this point because it's really important. It does not matter what Democrats do. The Republican Party, as currently constituted, will expand the court the next time they have the power and the need to do so. Now, the third point was the point about building a new epoch in which we can restore some sanity to our politics. If Democrats entrench democracy, that will expand the electorate. The disfranchised current electorate is 15% more Democratic than the existing electorate, and the existing electorate is about 7 to 8% Democratic favoring. That's the Democratic margin in the generic congressional ballot. That's the Democratic margin. Actually, Joe Biden is up by about 9 points according to the average of polls. If you expanded that by enfranchising people who don't vote, who are overwhelmingly leaning Democrat, then suddenly the Republican Party will start to lose elections rather than being able to win because of these structural deformities in the system and vote suppression. They'll realize they need to appeal more broadly to the American populace. That will mean abandoning their racism, their misogyny, their homophobia, their xenophobia, their Islamophobia, and their neo-Ayn Randian extreme libertarian policies of tax cuts for the wealthy, economic deregulation, environmental degradation, opposition to healthcare expansion, opposition to raising the minimum wage, opposition to free college for the less affluent. Every policy I just named has not only majority support, but pretty much overwhelming majority support. They don't happen because the Republican Party opposes them, and the Republican Party is able to remain in power because of these structural democratic deficits and voter suppression. Here's the independent case for court expansion, and then I'll quit, and I think I might still get within 40 minutes, within the 40-minute limit. I want to start with a statement Mitt Romney made the other day for why he's willing to go along with McConnell's rank hypocrisy and confirm Amy Barrett. He said something like this. This is close to a quote. "My Democratic friends have grown accustomed to believing they're entitled to control of the court, but it's a center-right country and it should have a center-right court." Now, as much as I admire Mitt Romney for being a profile in courage in a Republican Party that is desperately lacking them, this is not just a wrong statement, it is a ludicrously wrong statement. All 3 of his factual premises are obviously wrong. The court has not been controlled by Democrats or liberals since 1969. Democrats were about to take control of the court for the first time in nearly 50 years when Justice Scalia could not time his death to occur during a Republican presidency. Mitch McConnell stole that seat. It's not a center-right court. It's the most conservative court in nearly 100 years. And this is not a center-right country. After November 3rd, Democrats will almost certainly have won the popular vote in the presidency 7 of the last presidential contests. Democrats won Senate contests across the country by 18 million votes in 2018, but that translated into only 47 Senate seats. Every one of the policies I just mentioned, like expanded health care, raising taxes on the wealthy, path to citizenship for immigrants, more gun control, all of those are favored by substantial majorities. The affirmative case for controlling the court is the structural disadvantages of geographic districting, the Senate and the presidency ensure that Democrats do not control the government even when they have majority support. Even though Democrats will have won 7 of the last presidential elections, there will be 5 Republican justices appointed by George W. Bush and Donald Trump, presidents who entered the White House without having won a plurality of the popular vote. With regard to Senate confirmation, 4 of the Republican justices will have been confirmed narrowly by senators who do not represent a majority of the country, meaning if you reapportion the Senate according to one person, one vote, those justices would have been rejected by the Senate. Now, you can't fix the Senate and the presidency directly because you need a constitutional amendment, and you can't possibly get a constitutional amendment when one of the political parties benefits from the status quo. You can create new states, and the first thing Democrats should do in January is to make the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico states if they want to be. That would ameliorate the political consequences of the malapportioned Senate, but it wouldn't fix the malapportionment, and it would only slightly ameliorate the problem. But as I said before, there is nothing in the Constitution about the size of the court. You can't fix the Senate, you can't fix the presidency very easily, but there is nothing preventing Democrats from changing the size of the court. Now, I'm not advocating the general use of hardball by Democrats. Republicans play hardball. I don't think Democrats should do this in the same way. Democrats should not suppress likely Republican voters. Democrats should not gerrymander legislative districts. Democrats should not cancel elections. Democrats should not force voters to face a choice between getting sick and possibly dying from COVID or giving up their right to vote, as Wisconsin Republicans have done for the last 10 months. But where the hardball is morally neutral and the size of the court is not a moral question, and Democrats are clearly being cheated out of democratic outcomes, you need to respond in kind. Now, the last point to emphasize is you may only get one chance to do this. Democrats are likely to have control of the national government in January. If they don't, this is all academic. It is a moot point. None of this will happen. In the off-year elections, Republicans will make gains. Obama won a landslide in 2008. Democrats won 60 seats in the Senate and large majorities in the House. That House majority disappeared in the first off-year election. Mitch McConnell is laying the groundwork for an unsuccessful Biden presidency. If you're wondering why he will not agree to a coronavirus relief package before the election, it's because he assumes, as I do, that Donald Trump will lose the election, and he doesn't want to improve the economy, and he doesn't want a $2 trillion coronavirus relief package to be on Trump's credit card. He wants it to be on Biden's credit card. Demographic changes may put the Senate out of reach for Democrats for good. I will give you 2 illustrations of that demographically. Trump lost the popular vote by 2 points in 2016, but he won the popular vote in 30 states. For the first time in American history in 2016, every Senate race that was contested was won by the candidate of the same party that won the presidential vote in that state. So if you project that forward, and it's not a crazy scenario, because basically there is no party ticket splitting anymore. It's tiny compared to what it was 30 or 40 years ago. It's quite plausible that if 30 states vote for the Republican presidential candidate, those 30 states will elect 60 senators. Also, the 2040 demographic projection is 15 states will hold 70% of the US population. Those 15 states will elect 30 senators. The other 35 states, which hold only 30% of the population, will elect 70% of the senators. If today's correlation between rural, sparsely populated states and Republican voters hold, Democrats will never win the Senate again unless the parties somehow realign. This is not democracy, and it's not tenable in the long term. The Supreme Court could very well invalidate every measure a Biden administration takes to entrench democracy or to ameliorate economic inequality. And by the time the court does so, it may be too late for Democrats to do anything because they could easily have lost control of the House and the Senate. So as I said, not only should Democrats do this, but they may need to just do it right away rather than waiting, as my colleague Charles Fried argued in the New York Times earlier this week, to see what the court does. The court is composed of very savvy, politically strategizing Republican justices who understand not to provoke a democratically controlled national government, but rather to keep their powder dry and not vote their ideological preferences until Democrats no longer control the government. Okay, that's what I had to say.
Thank you so much, Mike. There's a lot to think about. Before passing it over to Bob, I wanted to just get your thoughts on Joe Biden telling Leslie Stahl. He conducted, sorry, it was Norah O'Donnell. He didn't walk out of the Leslie Stahl interview. Joe Biden said he would appoint a commission and that it would meet for 6 months. I'm curious about your thoughts. If you're going to be on it, if you're going to be recommending people for it. But in all seriousness, what can the commission do? Can it buy him anything politically? What are your thoughts? Because it's also a question of, does Joe Biden want to play hardball?
Yeah, so let me say a couple things. First about Joe Biden. Biden said in the primaries that he was not interested in expanding the size of the court. There are lots of Democratic senators who also were not interested in expanding the size of the court. I would never have dreamed in the first 56 years of my life that I would support expanding the court. However, I did think that the theft of the Garland nomination, the Scalia seat, justified expanding the court. I think what the Republicans did in the last 2 months is to overplay their hand and provoke a backlash. The utter and complete hypocrisy of doing exactly what they argued 4 years ago could not be done, and actually having video clips showing Lindsey Graham and Charles Grassley and Joni Ernst saying that a president should not be appointing a justice in the last year of a president's term. The utter hypocrisy. This is just about political power. It has nothing to do with principle. I understand they say now that the rule is different when the same party controls. I'll be happy to respond to that. It's an absurd argument, and it's not what they said 4 years ago. So the utter hypocrisy has enraged Democrats, and I think many people are open to something that they wouldn't. Biden's position is, I'm not going to talk about this before the election, and I support that. I'm going to write an op-ed basically laying out, I'm negotiating with the Atlantic to publish a week or two after the election. I don't want to advocate this before the election because I don't see any reason why we ought to change the conversation. Now, you might say, well, that's disingenuous. The Republican Party doesn't have a platform, right? They're running without a platform. Donald Trump has said for 4 years that I'm going to replace Obamacare with something better, and he will not tell you what his plan is. So I don't want to hear anything about how Joe Biden somehow is obligated to tell you his position on court expansion. Historically, appointing a commission is a way to play for time, and usually these things are fixed and they'll confirm whatever it was that the person who appointed them wanted them to do. Yeah. I don't know if Biden knows what he wants to do. Biden said some very scary things to me as a progressive Democrat during the primaries. He said, oh, I think once Trump is gone, the Republicans will restore their sanity and you can negotiate with them. That's just untrue. I mean, it's almost like if he believes that he missed the 8 years of his own vice presidency, yeah. I think he knows what's going on right now, and I hope he can be persuaded. I don't know if I would serve on the commission, and it may be that my views have been stated and are sufficiently radical, I wouldn't be appointed. I thought I might have the opportunity a week ago to talk to Democratic senators. We were negotiating about this, and sometimes they have outside speakers at their weekly lunches, and I would have been the outside speaker if they'd had an outside speaker. I want to encourage them to understand how dire the situation is, and I think a lot of them do now because, you know, a lot of the old timers, people like Leahy or the institutionalists, you know, people like Coons from Delaware, They don't want to do this, but they are so angry and outraged by the Republican hypocrisy. And that's often how social reform happens. As you know from my classes, there's a backlash phenomenon. One side overplays their hand. Bull Connor beats up the black demonstrators who are mostly children on television, and suddenly Americans support landmark civil rights legislation that they never supported before. Well, people are talking about court expansion in a way they've never talked about before. I'm hopeful it happens. I wish it didn't have to happen. I'm actually open to the possibility of negotiating a short-term expansion with a long-term solution that is more bipartisan and gets us out of this crazy way in which we constitute the court. You know what I'm talking about, the 18-year staggered terms. I'd actually say to Democratic senators, let's demonstrate we're not partisan. All we want to do is entrench democracy, make sure the court doesn't strike it down, and doesn't strike down all of the reform legislation that we were just elected by a landslide to implement. If we can do that, we are willing in the long term to negotiate a more bipartisan solution. I would support that, but they cannot be allowed to gut everything that a Biden administration does. It would destroy the progressive movement. Millions of people will give up on politics. What's the point if the Supreme Court's just going to strike down everything you do?
Bob, please. Bob Kuttner.
Well, that was a real tour de force, Michael. Thanks so much for that. I agree with everything you said about Republican theft of democracy and the need for Democrats to try to entrench democracy. I want to take 5 minutes and talk about how the Republican courts might steal this election. And then I want to spend about 10 minutes adding a political economy dimension to Michael's analysis. So the odds are overwhelming that Biden wins the election, and he may well win it on election night. There are a few ways this could come off the rails. People have talked about violence and Trump encouraging violence and then using violence as a pretext to put down insurrections and disrupt voting. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the bigger risk is that, and I'm not the first person who's made this point, is you're going to have a blizzard of litigation about improper votes, and you're going to have ballot boxes seized, and you're going to have Republican courts doing whatever they can at the state level to interfere with outcomes being accurately reported. We know the shenanigans going on in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where in Wisconsin, we've already seen the Supreme Court, and this was even before Barrett, intervene to overturn a lower court ruling, allowing an additional 6 days for ballots to be received and counted. And we could see a repeat of that in Pennsylvania. Clearly, the Trump strategy, and Trump is convinced that by definition, if he loses the election, it was a fraudulent election. So the Trump strategy is to get that question into friendly courts, or if that doesn't work, get Republican-controlled legislatures to put up competing slates of electors and then throw the thing into the House. I think those are the horrible scenarios. I think they're probably unlikely because if you do the arithmetic, the states that Biden is almost certain to carry overwhelmingly get you to 260 electoral votes. And then you've got a menu of 4 states, North Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, of which Biden only has to carry 1 to get to 270. So it may well be that we actually do know who the winner is on election night. And this scenario of a prolonged interregnum will not happen. It may happen. I mean, I don't buy the arithmetic that there's a 9 in 10 chance of Biden winning the election, because I think there's a better than 1 in 10 chance of one of these Republican tactics creating this prolonged interregnum, and then anything could happen. But I want to spend most of my 15 minutes adding a political economy dimension to Michael's analysis. Here's a statistic. when Clinton ran against Dole, if you look at counties where the median income is 85% of the national median, that are overwhelmingly majority white, those counties split almost evenly. In 2016, they went for Trump 640 to 2. So the question is, what are white working class people doing voting for this guy? Even if we accept Michael's view, and I totally agree with it, that this country, if you look at the popular vote, is majority Democratic. Why did Trump carry the white working class vote by something in excess of 30 points? And why did Hillary Clinton lose the white female vote against Donald Trump, of all people? And I think the answer is that even though other things being equal, a majority of Americans vote for Democrats, that under Clinton and under Obama, the Democratic Party at the presidential level became a Wall Street afflicted party. That more of the deregulation that destroyed the economy in 2008 was done under Democrats than was done under Republicans. And then Hillary tried to make up for the fact that she was in bed with Wall Street by going left on identity politics issues, which was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. So in a country where the Progressive Party really was a progressive party, you would have a greater likelihood of people voting their pocketbook interests. And people did vote their pocketbook interests to some extent, and they were complicated by cultural grievances and racial grievances because they didn't see Democrats sticking up for their pocketbook interests. They saw declining living standards and declining opportunities and declining economic security for a 40-year period, even though Democrats had the White House for much of that 40 years. And so Trump comes along as a kind of bogus populist and a tough guy, scapegoating immigrants, scapegoating people of color. A lot of voters said, yeah, why not? I'll show the people who have been disrespecting me. Another data point. Normally, when a president and the president's party gets repudiated at the polls, as we expect Trump to be repudiated next Tuesday, the party moves more towards the center. It moves more in a moderate direction. Nobody thinks this is going to happen. What's going to happen is that in the states where Republican voters are a majority, and that's a lot of the Rocky Mountain West, it's a lot of the South, it's some of the Midwest, you just know that when you have the next primary for senator or governor or for state legislature seats, the further right-wing candidate is going to win. Well, what's that about? Well, that's about the base of the Republican Party being a hardcore right-wing base. And I think that data point has something to do with the first data point. People who don't see the Democratic Party sticking up for their pocketbook interest become Trumpies, become Tea Party voters, become voters who look at Fox and Limbaugh as gospel. And I worked in the Senate as chief investigator for the Banking Committee at a time when you could draw a line between Washington State and West Virginia and not pass through a state that had Republican senators. So the idea that we are doomed to being a minority party because of the original sin of the gerrymandered Senate, that's belied by history. From the New Deal period through the 1970s, you had progressive populist Democrats elected and reelected, labor Democrats, in every one of those states that you don't imagine today would ever elect a Democrat. Washington, Oregon, but also Idaho, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Kansas, right through to Tennessee and West Virginia. And in some of those states, the border southern states, they weren't great on race, but boy, were they ever economic populists like Estes Kefauver or Al Gore. And that's not the Democratic Party, certainly not at the presidential level that we have anymore. So I think to some extent, the Democrats becoming a Wall Street party are partly to blame for Trump. So it seems to me that the kind of reforms Michael is talking about are absolutely necessary, but they're not quite sufficient. We need not only to take back American democracy, we need to take back the Democratic Party from Wall Street wing that has really captured the Democratic Party at the level of the presidential party. There are lots of progressive Democrats in Congress. If you look at the fights between progressives in Congress and presidents over the past 30 or 40 years, I'm thinking particularly of Clinton and Obama, but also to some extent Carter, on issues like trade, on issues like financial deregulation, on issues like public investment. The congressional party has been somewhat to the left of the Democratic Party. And here's the other point. This is kind of the punchline. You have this midterm election jinx, right? So Obama in 2010 loses 63 seats, which broke the previous record, which was Bill Clinton in 94 in his first midterm election, losing 55 or 56 seats. This is not just the midterm jinx. Roosevelt picked up seats in 1934. This is Democrats failing to deliver for their constituents. And yeah, some of that was because McConnell blocked it. But I did a couple of books on this. Obama appointed very, very conservative people to his budget and finance team. And in 2009, when Obama was still very popular, Nancy Pelosi and the House Democratic Caucus begged him to support a second stimulus package. And Obama instead was listening to the deficit hawks. He was listening to the Wall Street guys who were his top financial advisors. And he made sure that the Senate killed that. And instead, in his State of the Union address in January of 2010, he appoints the Bowles-Simpson Commission. He says, we're going to have recovery summer. The economy is just doing fine, and now we need to pivot to deficit reduction. That was absolutely suicidal. And it was because Obama, who was elected as a healer, a unifier, first Black president, foreign policy progressive, was listening to conservatives on economic issues. There were a lot of white working class people who voted for Obama, by the way. And Obama just, at the end of the day, did not deliver enough. So I think if Biden is to be spared the midterm jinx, which would put an end to his presidency almost before it started, Biden has to figure out a way to deliver tangible stuff to regular people in the first 2 years, in the first 18 months. He has to do an infrastructure package, a COVID relief package that is very, very, very front loaded, that bears fruit early on, as Roosevelt did in his first couple of years with the short-term WPA projects and other things that actually showed tangible benefits to regular people. I'm afraid that Biden is going to be whipsawed between his more conservative advisors because he comes out of exactly the same milieu of Obama and Clinton, and he'll throw the progressives some bones, and he won't go far enough either on the democracy entrenchment kind of agenda that Michael is talking about, or on the progressive populist economic agenda that I'm talking about. And then we are really screwed, because I think Michael is right that this could be our one chance for a long time. And it's not just a matter of winning democracy back, it's a matter of winning constituencies back, so that people in the Rocky Mountain states, in the South, that once elected progressives no longer see their bread as being buttered on the side of the Tea Party and Donald Trump. I think it's both and. And in order to get the popular support to have a working majority to do the kind of democratic entrenchment reforms that Michael is talking about, you also need the economic stuff. we also need to persuade regular people that Democrats don't care more about Davos than they care about Dubuque. You have to persuade regular people that Democrats care more about whether you can put bread on the table than about bathroom rights. And this is going to be tough stuff. I'm not saying that you give up on LGBT people, but I'm saying in order to make it possible for those kinds of reforms to be palatable to socially conservative working class people, you have to bend over backwards to deliver the goods economically. And that's, I think, what Democrats have failed to do. So it's not enough that we win, we prevail by 9 points nationally. We have to prevail state by state. If we're going to take back the Senate, we need to win some of these close Senate races by persuading regular people that we are on their side economically to offset some of the cultural reformism that sticks in the craws of socially conservative working class voters. So I think it's both and, but I really salute Michael. I have not heard a rendition like that in just 40 minutes of all of the bads. And I wrote a book on this. It's called The Stakes, 2020 and the Survival of American Democracy. It took me 260 pages and he did it in 40 minutes. So bravo.
I do have a feeling that if his overall paper were to be published, it would probably run out to about 260 pages. I'm going to turn this back over to Dan in just a moment, but I want to remind people who are watching this that we are open for questions. We're welcoming your questions, and please post those in the Q&A, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And I'll just start with one question seeking a very concise answer from each of you, and that is, you've both focused on what Biden should do should he win. What happens if he loses? What happens if Trump wins again without a clear platform? What is your expectation of what is likely to happen? And again, we're open for questions. Please enter them into the Q&A box.
Do you want to go first, Robert, or would you prefer that I do?
I think we cease to be a democracy. I mean, I wrote a whole book about this. This is our last chance to reclaim democracy. And if Trump manages to hang on to office, I wrote a whole book about all of the horrible things they didn't get around to in his first term, that he can get around to in his second term, and we really become a police state.
I'm pretty pessimistic, but I don't know if I'm that pessimistic. I mean, my first impulse is to move to Canada, or I'm lobbying for New Zealand, but my wife won't agree because we have 4 kids who are still in the United States. When I think hard about it, I realize that's the coward's way out. And I think about what great social reformers like Thurgood Marshall or Martin Luther King or the women's suffragists or the abolitionists had to overcome. And I realize that leaving and giving up is not really an option. Trump will be unleashed, and that means any constraints, and there aren't a lot remaining within the Republican Party, and certainly the Supreme Court will be removed. Freedom House ranks countries based on democracy in terms of politics and civil rights. And my wife and I were just looking at this at lunchtime today. Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden and Finland have almost perfect records. They're almost 100, or some of them are 100. The United States is already down to about 86, and it will decline quite a bit further. But there are lots of countries in the world that are the 10s or 20s. I think even after another Trump presidency, he can't throw the New York Times journalists in jail. He can't throw me in jail for saying all these awful things, or Robert in jail for saying these awful things about him. That's already happening in India. One of my LLM students who's back in India says that critics of the Modi regime are already being incarcerated. I don't think the New York Times will be shut down, unlike in countries like Hungary and Poland, where they've really made significant incursions against the democratic press. But things will get really bad. The courts will be lined up behind Trump. Trump will thoroughly dominate the government. He's already said he's going to fire the FBI director, the CIA director, his Secretary of Defense. He will corrupt the government even more in terms of personal profit. Will he start throwing his political adversaries in jail? I'm not sure that he can do that. Right, Robert. So it's hard to know exactly what he will do. I think the Freedom House, score for the United States goes down from 86 to something in the 70s. Does it go down to the 50s? The United States has a more entrenched democracy. Trump is very unpopular, unlike someone like Viktor Orban or Recep Erdogan. The United States is not going to become a totalitarian country like China. Even Hungary and Poland still allow protests. They don't throw political protesters in jail. So Robert's going to disagree, and I want to hear what he has to say. But I'm really pessimistic, and I think you may be even a little more pessimistic than I am in
on
that
the
regard.
question of a free press, let me give you three things they could do very, very easily. They could pass an Official Secrets Act so that reporters who publish classified stuff can be put in a slam. They could overturn Times v. Sullivan. They could come up with a criminal libel law. They could very easily redefine what's a 501c3 so that all kinds of nonprofit organizations that, in fact, just between us, do engage in politics are put out of business. And that would not hurt. That would kill progressive nonprofits that depend on foundation grants. Right-wing nonprofits would go right along because they have the Koch brothers. So, and I've got a whole book on this. So there's a lot of really, really bad stuff he could do. And hopefully we don't have to go there, because I think Biden's probably going to win. I think you think Biden's probably going to win. And this will have been one of the narrowest escapes of a democracy ever. And then we have to make sure, both on the economic front and on the constituency front and on the entrenchment of democracy front, that we absolutely maximize the moment and don't squander the moment the way the last two Democratic presidents have.
So we're totally agreed on that. I think that's absolutely right. I want to add one thing and then add a point of clarification for something that came up before, and I think some of the students in the audience won't fully appreciate. So the clarification is just, if we do dodge a bullet, it's mostly because of luck, because I think you and I would probably agree that Trump was more likely than not, maybe not by a lot, but more likely than not to win re-election as of February. And if he had done a halfway decent, good faith response on the coronavirus, if he had tried to do what Democratic governors done, he would have reaped the benefits. So if we escape this, it's not because the American people have rallied behind democracy. It's just because of the same sort of contingencies that got him elected in 2016, which is a really scary thought. I wanted to just elaborate on something you said, but you brushed over, and I don't think the students will fully appreciate it, and it's important. The students need to understand exactly what Republican legislatures are doing throughout the country with regard to this election. Every possible way to make it more difficult to vote, they are undertaking, and Republican judges around the country are fine with it. So let me give you an example, and then let me explain, make the best case for what the court's doing and explain why it's not persuasive. So in Texas, for example, they've refused to have universal absentee voting. They're basically saying, if you're worried about COVID, tough luck, we're going to make you go out and vote. Also, even more egregiously, what the governor of Texas said last week was, we're going to have one drop-off ballot place. So this is for people who are voting absentee but don't trust the Postal Service because Trump has a lackey undermining the Postal Service during an election where more mail-in ballots are being cast than any time in American history. He said that in Harris County, Texas, we're going to have one drop-off ballot place, even though Harris County is bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Now, there's no good argument for that. It's simply that they want to make it harder for people to vote. In South Carolina, they're saying you have to go and get your absentee ballots witnessed, even though to get somebody sitting next to you to witness it is it's contraindicated by every public health expert. In Alabama, they're refusing to allow you to drop off your absentee ballot in a car to vote in a car if you're disabled. No good reason for that. They just want to do that. In Wisconsin and other states, they're refusing to count absentee ballots that arrive after election day. You still have to postmark it by election day, but they're not going to count it after election day, even though Trump's postmaster general is sabotaging the election, and even though we're getting more absentee ballots than ever before. Now, why are there's a recent study by Take Back the Court showing that 80% of Republican judges have voted to uphold these measures, whereas most Democrats vote to strike them down. The Supreme Court's position is based on a case from 15 years ago called Purcell, where the court in a per curiam, not fully reasoned out decision said, look, there's a presumption against changing election rules close to the election. Now, they've turned that into a principle that it really wasn't. It was just kind of an offhand remark in a per curiam decision, but it makes a certain sense to say we're not going to change rules very close to an election. But there are two qualifications to that. First of all, that is a rule that obviously is subject to exceptions, and we are experiencing a once-in-a-century pandemic where, of course, people should be allowed to vote unless there's a good reason not to. The second point is the court's opinion, and it's worth reading, it's pretty short. The court's opinion doesn't say a word about legislatures acting in bad faith. They just pretend this has nothing to do with politics, and legislatures are the experts in weighing competing factors like how should you accommodate voters during a pandemic. But what's going on is obviously bad faith, where Republicans are trying to suppress the vote in every possible way and Democrats are trying to expand it. Now, you know, the Supreme Court justices are not stupid people. John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh are brilliant lawyers. They know what's going on. They are acting in bad faith, pretending that this is about some Purcell principle where we're deferring to Democratic decision makers, when really they are conspiring to help Democrats. I actually think they're wasting political capital because Trump's going to lose by enough, I think, that none of this will make a difference. And I agree with everything Robert said. There could be violence and there could be efforts to steal the election, but it's really important. If Biden wins by a lot, I don't think that stuff is nearly as likely. And he's very likely to win by a lot. He's more likely to win in a landslide than he is to lose, according to Nate Silver.
Dan, questions? And then we have a number of questions that have come in our Q&A box. So yeah. I'd like to get to those questions. Dan?
Yeah, so a quick one, and it's for both of you. Michael, one of your colleagues at Harvard, Jill Lepore, recently came out kind of against some sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a backwards looking take on what has happened. President Obama famously sort of didn't go after things that happened in the Bush administration. I'm just curious about whether you think, Lepore was right, that that's sort of not in keeping with the American historical tradition, and any thoughts about how we should kind of reckon with our recent history. This could include the family separation or other things that happened in the past 4 years.
So I haven't read her piece, and I haven't given a lot of thought to things like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's pretty obvious to me that we need to do a lot with regard to race. The stuff that's gone on in the last 4 years, I would have thought was inconceivable. We have a president who is an open racist. The president of the United States says that Black and brown congresswomen should go back to their countries, their broken down countries, even though they're American citizens. He insults Black athletes who are protesting racial injustice and tells them to leave the country. He says he's going to defend the suburbs from low-income housing, which everybody understands means Black and brown people. After having a non-white president, who would have ever thought that the United States could regress to the point of having a racist president? And, watching the murder of Black people by white police officers, watching the effect of COVID on Black and brown citizens, looking at the wealth disparities, after the recession of 2009, the Great Recession, African Americans control 1/13 of the wealth of white families. I mean, obviously we need to do something about that. I actually think the policy agenda is pretty clear. You need dramatic police reform. You need efforts to make college more available to people who are not affluent. You need things like a higher minimum wage, so forth and so on, more investment in minority communities. I think the agenda is pretty clear. You just need the political will to execute it. In American history, I think it's pretty clear that anti-poverty programs that are not specifically explicitly about race are more politically salient, are more politically sellable. So I'm in favor of that. But with regard to police violence, I mean, this just needs to end. We need dramatic police reform. I don't know, I don't know what defunding the police even means anymore, but there are thousands of police officers out there who should not be police officers, people who like to exert authority, people who like to escalate violence. And that's just a huge problem, and something needs to be done about it. The problem is so much needs to be done on so many different issues. Yeah. And Biden, as was said earlier by Robert, Biden needs to prioritize the things that will gain him votes in the 2022 off-year elections. And I don't know, I'm not a political strategist. I don't know what the best strategy there is. So we need tremendous investment in minority communities. We need to do something about all the racism. I don't know whether a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is necessary to do that. I think we already know pretty much what we need to do. We just need the summon the will to do it. One thing I'm optimistic about, I'm not very optimistic in general, but the one thing I'm optimistic about is young people, if they ran the world, they would solve our problem. The racism problem is a problem of older generations. It's the Fox News viewers, and the median Fox News viewer is 65 years old, a bunch of old white guys. They're the ones who can't adjust to a world where the United States is not going to be a majority white nation. And one thing, I agreed with almost all of Robert said about the Democratic Party being taken over by the libertarians as well, the Wall Street people. But there is a very strong correlation between racial resentment and votes for Trump, both in the primaries and in the general election. And the displaced white working class, they don't have to vote for Trump. They can vote for Bernie Sanders. So part of what's making them receptive to Trump is, as Robert said, economic dislocation. But also, these people support a wall with Mexico, and they support a Muslim travel ban. So they have very high scores on the social scientist racial resentment factor. And the younger generation doesn't have that. So they don't have any problem with racial diversity and racial tolerance and Black Lives Matter. So I am optimistic we're going to get better in those regards. And some of the problem will just die off through generational replacement. I'm sorry, that was too long an answer.
Well, let me ask two questions that have come in that are related to each other and that also relate to what you just said. There's a question as to why it is that 40% of the American electorate that supports Trump doesn't see him as a threat to democracy. And why is it that those folks are so opposed to the ACA?
Robert, you go, because maybe you wanted to say something on the race and reconciliation question as well.
Well, let me address this one. Jacob Hacker, in his new book, has coined the term plutocratic populism. It's fake populism in the sense that Trump is really a plutocrat. He's in bed with the richest people in the country, and he's corrupt. And if I were a Marxist, I'd call it false consciousness. I mean, he's very good at persuading people not to vote their own self-interest. The Affordable Care Act obviously has helped lots and lots of people. There was a governor of Kentucky who opted for the Medicaid provision and helped hundreds of thousands of Kentuckians get health care, didn't have health care. And as a gesture of gratitude, the good citizens of Kentucky voted him out of office because the Medicaid expansion was associated with the ACA. So Trump has succeeded in branding the ACA as associated with Obama and branding Obama as a bad guy, and thereby distancing people from their own self-interest. Now, the ACA is partly to blame. This is not a great piece of legislation. This is a piece of legislation that has maybe increased health coverage by about 8% of the population. And the Republicans have been very deft at persuading Medicare recipients that the undeserving poor are getting more health coverage, and that's coming out of Medicare coverage. And so a different approach to expanding health insurance might have been less toxic politically and less vulnerable politically than the ACA. But Trump's absolute feral genius has been getting people to vote against their own pocketbook interests by using race, by using racism, by using immigration, by using threats of the other, and people who are getting just completely screwed by his economic policies are willing to look the other way.
Do you want me to say something, or do you want to ask another question, Ted? Whatever you prefer.
Dan, do you have a point that you wanted to make?
So I think that Bob is absolutely right about the ACA, and as people might in framing and branding, and as people might know, when asked about various provisions and when it's framed as the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, it's more popular in polls than Obamacare. So I think it really has been a framing exercise.
One of the questions that came in asked whether there was any likelihood of moving from the current arrangement of 2 senators per state that seems to favor more rural interests and was originally intended to do precisely that. What would it take to change that?
So I can say a word in response to that. I also wanted to add a word on this fact that 40% to 45% are going to vote for Trump. Literally, you can't change the Constitution because the Constitution says this is the one provision still in the Constitution that by the Constitution's terms is unamendable without the consent of every state. So you cannot take away Wyoming's 2 senators without Wyoming's consent, and that's not going to happen. What you can do is add new states or subdivide existing states if they'd agree to it. So by statute, you could turn California into 5 different states or 10 different states. They'd still all be vastly larger than Wyoming. And you can certainly create Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. That will ameliorate the problem, but it doesn't solve the problem, which is there is no good argument today. And there actually was no good argument in 1787, according to James Madison. It was just Delaware and a small state playing a good game of poker and saying, we're not going to go along with the Constitution unless you give us equal representation in one house. So there are workarounds, which is you can create new states or carve out from existing states, new states if those states agree. But the chance, I suppose if you want to be really fancy about it, you could amend the entrenchment provision. The Constitution says that you can't take away 2 senators from every state without their consent, but I suppose you could just amend that provision of the Constitution, and then you just need a regular constitutional amendment, which itself is almost impossible to secure. On the point about 40 to 45%, 65 million people voting for Trump, I regard it as scary as hell and just really deeply upsetting. And I just feel sorry for the country. I mean, this is a really bad thing that you have a president who ran the country into the ground because of the coronavirus, who is a pathological liar, who cares about nobody but himself. And there are millions, tens of millions of Americans who not only think he's doing a good job, but a majority of Republicans think he's a better president than Abraham Lincoln. Tens of millions of Republicans think he's the best president that they've had during their lifetime. That is so sad, and it is scary as hell. Now, I'll give you a couple explanations. One of these is just, I think, piggybacking on what Robert said. Psychologists identify something called an authoritarian personality, and it turns out that's more correlated with Republican voting. The authoritarian personality is uncomfortable with change. It tends to see the world in terms of black and white. It tends to regard outsiders as dangerous. And people who feel that way have kind of clustered around Trump. They are scared of immigrants. They are very frightened about Muslims who they think are terrorists. So that's one factor. It is also true that there has been a generational degradation in the commitment to democracy. People born in the 1930s who experienced fascism are overwhelmingly supportive of democracy. Each generation succeeding that is less and less committed till you've gotten to a younger generation, which says in response to opinion polls, well, we're not really sure that a military dictatorship would be the worst thing in the world. So that's concerning. Another point is just that what people care about at the end of the day is, as Robert said, putting food on the table and protecting them from insecurity. One reason why China is expanding its influence in the world is that the Chinese are delivering the goods. They've shown they can deal with something like the coronavirus pandemic. And the United States looks increasingly like a failed government, a failed nation in its response to the coronavirus. The fact that the United States has 220,000 people dying, and yet the governor of North Dakota says, well, this is not really a problem for government. And the president of the United States says we're turning a corner, and the White House chief of staff says, oh, we're not going to control this. We're just going to give up. You know, that is a real problem. And if that's democracy, people are going to turn to China and say, hey, they're doing pretty well. They've got economic growth even in 2020 because they handled the pandemic. The last point is what Robert emphasized, which is that these cultural issues have diverted people from economics. When the working class was overwhelmingly white, and where the big issues were economic issues during the New Deal and the couple decades afterwards, working class whites were overwhelmingly Democratic. Democrats had a margin of something like 20% among whites. In the North, in the South, the entire region among whites was Democratic. But beginning in the 60s and then expanding in the 70s and 80s and more frequently, race became a big issue. Feminism and the rise of women's empowerment became a big issue. Gay rights became a big issue after the moral majority took over the Republican Party. Then guns, pornography. All of these cultural issues have built up a stark divide between rural and urban voters. Robert's exactly right. In the 1960s, you could look at Wyoming and Idaho and have no idea whether they'd have a Democratic or Republican senator. In 2016, the margin of victory for Trump in Wyoming was 42 points. What happened? When they were voting on populist economic issues, they were often likely to elect someone like Frank Church. But when they're voting on guns and gay rights and transgender bathrooms and Black Lives Matter, they're just Republicans. So, you know, the working class used to be overwhelmingly Democratic. Working class whites voted for Trump by 35 to 40 percentage points. And among working class males, white males, it was 45 to 50 points. That is just an unbelievable turnaround. And it is because they're not voting on economic issues. And maybe the Democratic Party screwed that up. But it's not just that. It's also these other issues which Democrats are right not to compromise on. We shouldn't compromise with racism. We shouldn't compromise with homophobia or misogyny. Somehow Democrats need to do both. They need to be liberal on those identity issues. I don't like calling them identity issues because being a white male Christian is as big an identity issue, and that's what supplies the base of the Republican Party. They're all about identity politics as well. But Robert's right. I mean, Democrats need to deliver for working class people and have not done a great job about it in the last 30 years.
Briefly comment on that, if I may. I mean, there's a much more direct route to taking control of the Senate than breaking California into 10 states. And that's simply winning some of these mountain states that we used to win. I mean, the last three governors of Montana, which is a state that went for Trump by 23 points, which elected a progressive populist governor by 4 points. So 27-point spread gap. You run progressive populists, you can win these states. New Mexico has a progressive populist governor. It's possible on pocketbook issues to make inroads in some of these states. And the only way you're going to remotely come close to bulletproofing yourself on some of the lightning rod cultural issues is to make it clear whose side you're on economically.
We will run over by a few minutes because there are a couple of remaining questions. So I'm going to ask the indulgence of our panelists to give us just another 5 to 10 minutes before we have to break. You spoke in terms of workarounds vis-a-vis some of the issues that you've raised. Are there workarounds other than packing the court, which would address some of the legal issues that you raised initially in your presentations?
So I'm trying to think about this, and I've had some helpful discussions with some students and other people, because it very well may be that you can't get 50 Democratic senators to support what I've proposed. One sort of workaround, I don't know how Democrats can solve the problem of a Republican court for the next generation, but maybe you can solve the problem of them potentially striking down every piece of legislation that progressive Democrats may want to pass. So one thing to do would be to pass, as Norm Ornstein said the other day, and as Robert said now, a couple of key bills on expanding healthcare, doing something about the environment, infrastructure spending, pandemic relief, democracy entrenchment, provide in those bills for accelerated review in the Supreme Court, which you can do. Congress can say to the Supreme Court, we want expedited review. You need to review a case in the next year, and hold the sort of Damocles over the court with the understanding, you don't have to say this out loud, that if they strike down, if they dare to strike any of this down, then you will then expand the size of the court. That would be one possibility. The other possibility I alluded to, which came from one of my students, and I'm shamelessly stealing it, is some sort of deal where you basically say, look, you know, in the short term, Democrats need to control the court, but we're happy to negotiate a long-term disarmament pact where we do something like 18-year staggered terms with one justice leaving every 2 years, so you don't have this problem of justices timing their retirements to ensure that the president they want replaces them, to ensure that you don't have random presidencies with no appointments and other presidencies with 4 or 5 or even 6. I think some sort of deal like that might be conceivable, but it's very hard to, you can't negotiate a formal deal with the Supreme Court. And frankly, I wouldn't trust Republicans right now because Mitch McConnell has shown the only thing he cares about is political power. So as soon as Democrats have lost control of the Senate or the House, which could easily be in 2022, you may have lost the opportunity to do this. So it's very difficult to come up with workarounds for the Supreme Court. And the other solutions, like taking away jurisdiction, requiring supermajority rules to strike down laws, those all have very substantial problems. So as much as I would like, I can't come up with a great workaround. I would love to hear proposals.
Let me offer one, a different kind of workaround. And we're publishing a piece on about 100 possible workarounds. There are lots of bad Supreme Court decisions that are the result of misreading of statutes, that are not the result of invented constitutional doctrines. And I'll give you just one. So there's a totally innocent piece of legislation passed in 1925, I believe, it's the Federal Arbitration Act. Mm-hmm. And corporate America, in its genius, has used this statute to require consumers and employees to sign what used to be called contracts of adhesion, where if you go to work for the XYZ Corporation, you sign away your rights to litigate, your rights to vindicate your rights that have been passed by Congress, and it goes to a rigged arbitration process where the arbitrator is picked by the corporation, and you also give up your right to class action lawsuits. Now, all Congress has to do is say, hey guys, this was not the intent of what we meant when we passed the Federal Arbitration Act. We meant X, we did not mean Y. We explicitly preclude the use of the Arbitration Act to allow employers to require consumers or workers to sign away their rights as a condition of employment. Even this court would be hard pressed to invent a constitutional doctrine if Congress were sufficiently clear in making very clear what that statute meant. We're publishing a piece on this with about 100 cases where bad court decisions are the result of slightly ambiguous statutory language that the court then drives a truck through, which could be clarified by better statutory language. Some of this, yeah, you could have invented constitutional doctrines, but in most cases, better statutory language could close the door to a lot of judicial lawmaking that has helped, in this case, corporate America deprive workers of their rights. So it's a different kind of workaround, but you narrow the basis on which courts can render insane decisions.
One of the questions that came in was around whether Article 3 could somehow be used to limit the court's jurisdiction over certain kinds of matters. What's your opinion on that?
You can certainly do that. There's a Supreme Court case during Reconstruction that says even if you're obviously motivated by the desire to prevent the court from striking down a statute, in that case, Congress had passed a Reconstruction law, and the Congress was afraid, the Republican Congress was afraid the court would strike down the Reconstruction law. So they took away the court's appellate jurisdiction in a case that had already been argued, and the Supreme Court unanimously said that's okay. The problem with taking away the court's jurisdiction is it only says the Supreme Court can't resolve an issue. It says nothing about the courts of appeal. The courts of appeal are now dominated by Trump appointees who are bound by Supreme Court precedent. So suppose you pass a campaign finance law and you said the Supreme Court doesn't have jurisdiction to deal with cases arising under it. You would basically have said, okay, the courts of appeal, now dominated by Trump appointees, are the final arbiters, and they're bound by Supreme Court precedents that have already been very aggressive about striking down campaign finance laws. If you tried to take away all the federal court's jurisdiction, there's no precedent, and federal court scholars have argued about this. But since the Supreme Court's the one that would ultimately decide, I think the smart money is they'd say you can't take away all federal court jurisdiction over an important constitutional issue. I agree. What Robert said is a very good point. The Supreme Court justices' interpretation of the 1925 Arbitration Act are in such bad faith that I'd actually worry that they might reinvent Lochner and strike down a law that tried to prevent workers from waiving their rights to class action litigation or litigation of any kind. And I'd simply say in support of that, maybe you're more confident and I'm more cynical, that a court that could come within an inch of striking down the Affordable Care Act is a court that come up with constitutional rationale to strike down any law that they don't like. And a court that could decide Bush versus Gore can invent a constitutional rationale against anything they feel strongly against. Whether they would do it, they're very aware of how much political capital they have. And I agree with you, they're not going to come up with a constitutional rationale to invalidate every statute they don't like. And certainly,
harder for them.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Bob, do you have a comment on that? And then I'm going to ask each of you to offer some closing comments in this week before the election.
No, I mean, I think we had a good exchange on that. I'll be very brief. I think the odds are that we will just barely dodge a bullet, and that Biden really has to maximize the moment, both on the economic front and on the entrenched democracy front. And we're really asking a lot of him because, Bernie Sanders is not the nominee. Elizabeth Warren is not the nominee. This is a very centrist Democrat. His crowd is a crowd of very centrist Democrats. He will throw progressives a bone or two to the extent that he thinks he needs to. But to the extent that progressives have no place else to go, and the party unity this time is almost unprecedented because everybody from the Revolutionary Communist Party to the Greens realizes the stakes, and they're all voting for Biden. So if we're not careful, we could get some of Biden's old cronies saying, the people just want a reversion to normal. And you don't have to move in a progressive direction. Normal is not going to fix what's broken. A very, very aggressive set of policies and politics on restoring and reclaiming and re-entrenching democracy and on progressive economic pocketbook issues, that just barely keeps you in the ballgame.
I agree with all that. And I also want to say something else, which is for those of you who I assume are most of the participants now who are young, I think that you ought to be optimistic about the future. And what makes me optimistic about the future is you, because you don't have a problem with a country that's not going to be majority white. And you believe in racial diversity and racial tolerance and Black Lives Matter and gay rights and the ability of people to choose what bathroom they use. You don't have any problem with all of that. And once you start exerting your political power, then the world is going to change. but you need to exert your political power. If you all voted in large numbers, Trump would be destroyed. He is going to lose among 18 to 24-year-olds by 35 percentage points. He's going to lose among college students by 50 percentage points. Your age group doubled its turnout between 2014 and 2018. If you double your turnout between 2016 and 2020, that's the end for Trump, and it may be the death of the Republican Party going forward. You have no excuse not to vote. You have the power to control this. John Lewis had his head bashed in at the Edmund Pettus Bridge because he cared about the right to vote. Many people literally lost their lives. Nobody's asking you to lose your life. People are asking you to wait in line or write a piece of paper and get your friends to vote and vote. And you have to stay engaged. And I'm sure based on what Robert just said, he's going to agree with this. It's not actually enough to vote. You need to be engaged all the time. If you don't vote in off-year elections, you're just going to revert to the same problem. If you don't keep pressure on the Democratic Party, it's going to revert to its moderation. There's nothing wrong with being politically engaged. 19th century Americans were incredibly politically engaged. People, at the founding of the country, I have this story. This is the last thing I'll say about this, delegate from Maine who showed up at the Massachusetts ratifying convention. Maine was part of Massachusetts. In mid-January, in the midst of a snowstorm, riding horseback and crossing rivers and risking drowning, this guy showed up at the Massachusetts ratifying convention because a bunch of his neighbors had an opinion about whether the Constitution should be ratified, and he took that pretty seriously. Nobody's asking you to do that. All people need to do is pay some attention, be civically engaged, and vote. So do it, and we'll have a better country.
I just need to add one more thing. While it is admirable that young people are not inclined to be racist or sexist or homophobic, it's also the case that young people have every reason to be terrified about their economic futures. If you compare the world that Michael and I grew up in, and you look at housing, you look at healthcare, you look at student debt, you look at the likelihood that you're ever going to have a job with a career attached to it as opposed to a short-term gig. Your generation is getting the short end of the stick, and you have to fight for economic justice as well as racial justice. You have to fight to make sure that you have the kind of opportunities that our generation had, and the two things go together, and then maybe we can get the kind of country that we want back.
Millions of Americans demonstrated, put their lives on the line, went to war to fight, and many died for the right that so many people now take for granted. This business of voting and participating in democracy is something that we've always held out to be special about our being part of the culture of the United States. And on the Northeastern campus, more than 700 students have signed up to vote over the past few weeks. And there's actually a polling place that will be located on the Northeastern campus for the first time in a very long time. So the opportunity to vote, the opportunity to participate in and preserve this democracy is something that's going to be open to us within the coming week. And a week from now, we'll assess what we know and what we've learned. But this is an extraordinary moment in American history, and a moment that folks ought not to be voyeurs on. This is a moment for active participation and engagement. Next week, the open classroom will debrief what we know at that moment. We'll have Governor Michael Dukakis, who himself ran for president, as our guest. And we're inviting everyone to really weigh in and express their views and opinions on how this election went. I want to thank our speakers tonight. It was really a highly enlightening conversation. Dan, thank you very much for bringing us together around this subject. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week with a great expectation that there will be high voter turnout and a result to that election that will help to protect the future of democracy. Thank you and good night to all.